December 14th of the year 557 AD, the city of Constantinople, at the time this was the Byzantine Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire, is hit by a significant earthquake. Buildings are damaged, including the famous Hagia Sophia Temple. At the time, this was a Christian church. However, after the Ottomans took over, it has more recently been a mosque, and then much more recently, after the fall of the Ottomans in the 20th century, the building was turned into a museum. December 14th, 704 or 705 AD. This is the date of death for King Alfred of Northumbria. That was one of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in England, before England eventually unified into one kingdom and then started taking over, well, a lot, everything. Not much is known about Alfred because of the time and the place where he lived. The few records we do have describe him as a man of learning, and he had roughly a 20-year reign, mostly a peaceful reign, between the years 685 and 704 or 705 AD. December 14th of the year 835 AD, the Sweet Dew Incident. With a name like that, it has to be good, and coming out of the medieval Chinese imperial court, that makes it even better. This was an attempted coup by the Emperor Wenzong of the Tang Dynasty. If he's already the Emperor, who is he launching a coup against? The answer is the court eunuchs. At various times in Chinese history, there were a bunch of eunuch government officials, and sometimes these eunuchs, pardon the pun, neutered the other offices of state, consolidating more power to themselves than they had a right to. Chinese government has always been a bureaucratic mess, go figure. Well, the emperor decided to conspire with one of his generals to oust a bunch of these eunuchs, the code phrase to begin the operation being Sweet Dew, which was an auspicious fortune-telling symbol. However, this coup went inauspiciously. The eunuchs figured out something was up before the coup even started, and they ended up launching a successful counter-coup, ousting a bunch of military and other government officials. December 14th of the year 1287 AD, St. Lucia's Flood. This was a famous flood in the Netherlands and northern Germany, caused by high tides and a fluke weather event, which caused the death of over 50,000 people. This was in fact one of the largest floods in recorded history. How did this happen? Let me explain. Well, much of the nation of the Netherlands is actually below sea level, and it is a coastal nation, so how do they manage this? The Dutch build and maintain a series of dams called dikes, and when so much depends upon human construction, well, even if you have the best engineers, you're bound to have a disaster at least a couple times a millennia. And this was one of those times. Seawalls collapsed, and tens of thousands ended up drowning. Mongol invasions of most of the Eurasian landmass happened in the 13th century, that is the 1200s. So how is China, their first target, doing a century later? Well, December 14th, 1332 AD, this is Rinchen Khan. He was emperor of China in the Yuan dynasty, that is the imperial dynasty that the Mongols imposed on China. He died at the age of 8, and by this time the Mongol Empire was very much fracturing. One of the largest empires in human history, and they could not hold it together more than a few generations past Genghis Khan's death. However, Genghis Khan's descendants, as leaders of the various splintered-off fragments of what was the Mongol Empire, they still hold power in many of these various places. December 14th, 1542, this is the date of death for James V Stuart, King of Scotland. He died at the age of 30 in Falkland Palace. He inherited the throne at the age of 17. His mother was in fact in the House of Tudor. Specifically, that was Margaret Tudor, daughter of Henry VII, King of England. December 14th of the year 1542, this painting is Mary Stuart I, Queen of Scotland, otherwise known as Mary Queen of Scots. She was 1 week old at the time that she took the throne. This was after the death of her father, James V. Of course, she had regents who handled administration until she came of age. She was, though, forced to abdicate the throne at the age of 24. That was the year 1567. She was in and out of prison at various times for various reasons, mostly having to do with royal infighting. She was eventually executed in 1587, 20 years after giving up the throne. Her descendants, however, would go on to hold the throne of England, at least for a little while, and even after losing it, they would go on to stage the Jacobite Risings in Scotland. December 14th, 1780. This is the wedding date for Alexander Hamilton, the founding father who every millennial and zoomer knows who he is because they made a Broadway musical about him. I even heard a 10-year-old quoting the 10 Dual Commandments the other day. That was kind of wild. Alex and Elizabeth would go on to have several children, before Hamilton would, 23 years later, go on to die in a duel with none other than Vice President of the United States at the time, Aaron Burr. And you can see Eliza's portrait here. December 14th, 1782. The Montgolfier brothers in France, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, their names were Joseph and Jacques. They are the inventors of the first hot air balloon. On this date, they had their first successful test of the contraption, and throughout the next year, they would go on to show it off to numerous people. It would catch on in popularity, eventually becoming Jules Verne's favorite method of transport to write about. December 14th, 1799, this is the date of death for George Washington, father of the United States. He was an officer in the British Army during the French and Indian War, served in western Pennsylvania, saw some bloody battles there, became the general and de facto commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the American Revolution, and then, following the Constitutional Convention of 1787, he became the first president of the United States. He was the only president, I believe, to have been elected unanimously, and he voluntarily stepped down after his second term, valuing the peaceful transition of power in this brand new nation above his own personal gain. December 14th, 1812, the Napoleonic Wars. This is the day that the French invasion of Russia comes to an end. The French army was sent home dying of hypothermia. This would go on to be one of several historical examples of why you should not invade Russia during the winter. December 14th, 1814, the Battle of Lake Borgne, Louisiana. This is part of the War of 1812. I think actually a lot of people know about this war because of how often people joke that this is the war everyone forgets about. After the Revolution, the British would not stop attacking American ships and forcing sailors at gunpoint to join the British Navy. The Americans in this brand new country did not like that. The British tried to invade several places, north, south, and center. In the south, there was a Louisiana campaign a little later in the war, but before the British could get their troops on land, they had to secure a place to land. That is where this lake comes in. When the British got control of this lake, it allowed them to have a secure staging point from which to attack the city of New Orleans, where the scruffy, ragtag, thrown-together American militia sent the trained and disciplined British regulars packing. December 14th, 1819, this is the day that Alabama becomes the 19th state in the brand new United States. The first, quarter of the 19th century was a time when Americans, both north and south, were settling the Midwest pretty rapidly. The British, 1 or 2 generations before this, had treaty lines where settlers were not allowed to cross so they would not make the Indians mad. The brand new American government had no such thing. Heh, sorry, Cherokee. December 14th, 1836, the Toledo War comes to an end. This was a boundary dispute between the American state of Ohio and the American territory of Michigan, over a piece of land known as the Toledo Strip. This happened surprisingly a lot more often than you would think. These little squabbles between states or territories or colonies, that just depends what time each of these things happened. That is the reason Maryland is shaped that way, also the reason Delaware is shaped that way. That's the reason Pennsylvania has that little nub connecting it to Lake Erie. The story of how some of these states got their boundaries is actually pretty wild. But with the conclusion of this, technically a war, Michigan was allowed to become a U.S. state. December 14th, 1861, this is the date of death for Albert, Prince Consort. He was the husband of Queen Victoria of England, and with his death, she sorta went a little nuts. You may have heard of Victorian mourning practices with the black veils and the certain dress codes, and the social convention of staying inside for a certain period of time. Queen Victoria's mourning period lasted years, in fact decades. She went on to make life pretty unbearable for her children, even going as far as making a huge scene of crying at one of their weddings in grief over the death of her husband. December 14th, 1863, the Battle of Bean Station, Tennessee, American Civil War. This was a relatively small battle. The casualties were in the hundreds, not in the thousands. The number of engaged troops was in the thousands, not in the tens of thousands. However, this is known as the battle which ended the Knoxville campaign, and it ended in a Confederate victory. General James Longstreet, who was in charge of the Confederate forces at the time, soon after this campaign took his forces back over the mountains into Virginia, thus giving up the advantage earned by this victory. December 14th, 1896, the Glasgow Underground Railway is opened, thus giving subway service to the second largest city in Scotland. December 14th, 1902, the Commercial Pacific Cable Company lays a telegraph cable underwater between the cities of San Francisco and Honolulu, thus allowing greater communication between Hawaii and the American mainland. December 14th, 1903. 121 years to the day after the Montgolfier brothers in France with their hot air balloon, the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, test fly their first ever airplane prototype. They call this the Wright Flyer. December 14th, 1911. You are looking at the face of Roald Amundsen. He was the leader of a team of Norwegian explorers who were known to be the first to reach the South Pole, Antarctica. Leave it to the Norse. Funny enough, Antarctica did not used to be that cold. The freezing of that entire continent came on actually very suddenly. It happened when tectonic shift finally separated that continent from other continents, and the changing pattern of the ocean currents caused the freezing to take place. Penguins, who used to be used to much warmer climates, were among the few species to have survived this drastic and sudden change. December 14th, 1913, the launching of the Japanese battleship Haruna, which you can see here. This ship launched in the 1910s. It saw a lot of service in both world wars. It was finally sunk in July 1945, and the following year it was salvaged for scrap. December 14th, 1918, shortly after World War I comes to a close, this is Portuguese President Sidónio Pais, and this is the day of his death. He died by assassination, as a matter of fact, and that was not even the first attempt on his life that month. He had previously survived another assassination attempt just 9 days earlier on the 5th of December. December 14th, 1918, Friedrich Karl von Hessen abdicates the throne of Finland. This was a really weird time for Finland. They were previously part of the Russian Empire. Shortly after the Bolsheviks took over in 1917, they declared independence. Less than a year later, their parliament gets together and votes to elect a king. Who, pray tell, do they elect as king? Oh, the brother-in-law of the German Kaiser Wilhelm II. And they do this, by the way, in the final weeks of World War I, October of 1918. In those 2 months between October and December, the nation of Finland collectively looked at what the Allied powers were doing in Europe. They looked at their German king-elect, and they collectively asked themselves, wait a minute, do we really want this? The king-elect was sympathetic to that sentiment. He voluntarily gave up the throne on December 14th, and soon after, monarchy was abolished, Finland to adopt a different form of government. Then, within 2 decades, they would have the December 14th, 1918, a UK general election. A few significant things happened this time around. This was the first general election in the UK where women had the right to vote, and as for the election results in Ireland, if you don't recognize this image, that is the logo for the political party Sinn Féin. They are the Northern Ireland political party that wants a united Ireland. They want the UK to leave Northern Ireland so the nation of Ireland can be united as one island. They are not the IRA, they do not do terroristic acts, at least not on paper, but their membership has some overlap with the IRA. Well, this political party on this day won 47% of the popular vote. That is a landslide victory because of the multi-party system over there. That is nearly an outright majority. December 14th, 1939. Russia, before this, had been invading the nation of Finland in what is known as the Winter War. All the international idealist high-minded types who imagined that World War I would be the war to end all wars, and imagined that the League of Nations would be some kind of permanent peacekeeping body in the world, well, they did not like this. And so, on this day, Russia was expelled from the League of Nations. Now, I am sure that sanctions on Russia as a slap-on-the-wrist economic punishment for invading one of their neighbors, who not so long ago had been part of their empire, is going to work just peachy, just perfectly. Excellent track record on doing stuff like that. December 14th, 1940. This is the day that plutonium, which is a nuclear ingredient, is first isolated. This is a step towards the world getting nuclear weaponry. This happened, as a matter of fact, in a place called Berkeley, California. I suppose back in the day, many decades before they were rioting against a gay guy to protest bigotry, UC Berkeley actually did their share of scientific research as well. December 14th, 1943, this is the date of death for John Harvey Kellogg. If you've heard of Kellogg's cereal, this is the Kellogg in question. Born in Michigan, died in Michigan at the age of 91. December 14th, 1948, patent for the cathode ray tube amusement device is officially granted. This is known as the very first recorded electronic game. Again, that year is 1948. It worked by a cathode drawing an arc across the screen that represented an artillery shot, and there were actual plastic pieces on top of the screen representing various targets, airplanes, etc. It's kind of crazy that this early on, humanity has a video game. December 14th, 1955, United Nations Security Council Resolution 109. This resolution grants UN membership to a total of 16 different countries, these being from a wide range of continents and geographic regions. December 14th, 1958. This was during the third Soviet Antarctic expedition. This is the date that they reached the southern pole of inaccessibility, which is different from the magnetic South Pole. This point on the Antarctic continent is the point that is furthest inland from any ocean. December 14th, 1962, this is NASA's Mariner 2 spacecraft, and on this day it became the first craft to do a close flyby of the planet Venus, getting within 35,000 kilometers. December 14th, 1964, Heart of Atlanta Motel v. United States. This was a U.S. Supreme Court decision right in the middle of the Civil Rights era. This one held that the federal government could use the Commerce Clause to enforce the part of the Civil Rights Act that says businesses may not discriminate on race. Commerce Clause is the part of the Constitution that gives the federal government oversight over interstate commerce. The reason that was written in there was because under the Articles of Confederation, every state pretty much did its own thing, and states frequently butted heads with one another, so they needed a higher authority to mediate some of those situations. In particular, ones where money-making operations are in more than one state. Well, with this Supreme Court case, we have that higher mediating authority, butting into a money-making operation that is in one single state, a motel, and the court grappled with the question of whether they were allowed to do that. December 14th, 1981, Israel's Knesset passes the Golan Heights Law. This is the law that officially extended the laws of the nation of Israel to the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights, of course, being a region now controlled by Israel, but that also borders the nations of Syria and Jordan. Are Israel imperialists? Are they allowed to do that? Ask as many people as you want and you will get infinite answers to that question. December 14th, 1995, the Dayton Agreement. This was the agreement that ended the Bosnian War and brought at least some amount of peace to the Balkan region, so called because it was signed in Dayton, Ohio. However, the signing in Dayton, Ohio was not the same signing as the December 14th one. That signing of this agreement took place that November, and then a couple weeks later they signed it again in Paris, but the Paris signing was mostly ceremonial. December 14th, 2012, the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in Connecticut. This was, of course, a school shooting in the United States. What else is new? This one in particular, though, has political ramifications. This is the one where the families of the victims got together and sued news broadcaster Alex Jones in court. He was sued for defamation because apparently he said some of these families were paid actors. The court ruled that Jones had to pay an excessive, unrealistic amount of money to these families. Over $1 billion that one person has to pay. There should be a law against that, but I digress. As of me recording this in 2026, I don't believe there have been any updates or appeals to that court decision. December 14th, 2016, this is the date of death for Bernard Fox. He was a British actor. You may know him from Hogan's Heroes, The Andy Griffith Show. He was also in the 1997 Titanic film. December 14th, 2025, the Bondi Beach shooting in Australia. Again, talking about mass shootings and terror attacks is not my favorite thing, but this one has political ramifications. This shooting was an Islamic terror attack by someone who had connections with the Islamic State, targeting a Jewish event in a Western nation. This was enabled by the trend of Western nations opening up their borders to the Third World. This was enabled by Western nations being willing to tolerate Islam creeping into our culture by degrees, but rather than addressing those underlying core issues, the government of Australia used this event as an excuse to confiscate many guns. December 14th, 2025, this is the date of death for Rob Reiner. Both he and his wife were apparently murdered, stabbed to death on the same day. His son has been charged with that murder. I believe that trial is still ongoing.